Well, welcome to Journey. My name is Jamie. I'm one of the pastors here. David was leading us, and we'll be back here in a little bit. David and I shared a really beautiful experience related to this song. The words of this song were penned actually a long, long time ago by a man named Francis. And David and I were part of a project where we went to Europe, and we had an opportunity to go visit some of the locations of the ancient poets and saints. And we learned a couple of things out of that, by the way. David and Leslie, who they were part of a band at the time, they created an album, and I wrote a book that kind of tells the memoir of our story, and then some of the individual stories of these poets and saints, including Francis. But the conclusion of that is we were all over Europe kind of discovering these famous people in our heritage, poets and saints in our heritage. We discovered two things. First of all, that most of them were pretty messed up. The people that we called saints were a mess. But it was from their brokenness that God used them. And the second thing that we discovered with these poets and saints is that each one seemed to interact with God in such different ways. And what was so intriguing about Francis in particular is that Francis found God in nature. We've been in this series called The Sound of Glory discussing how do we hear the voice of God. And for different people, we maybe there are some dominant ways in which we hear the voice of God. And then there's some other ways that maybe we just really haven't been attentive. Francis was super attentive at hearing God in the voice of creation. As a matter of fact, he's known for singing and preaching to the trees and to the animals. And he just had this overwhelming sense of love for all that God had made. Well, we had finished filming. We had worked on a 7-week kind of Bible study project that went along with this whole thing. It was this big, massive project we did. And we finished filming for the day and writing some of our stuff. And the cameraman pulled out his camera. He said, hey, let's just go record one of that song that Francis wrote, All Creatures. And it was taken years later and set to melodies and whatever else. And so the musicians pulled out their instruments, and we set up behind the basilica there in Assisi. And almost in rhythm with the insects. Like the insects were so loud. It was like in time. We just recorded them just singing this song. It was just this moment. I was there with my sons. And I mean, just this left you with this impression of being outside in creation and singing and speaking of what God has created. This Genesis story is inspiring. It's inspiring. I mean, sometimes for those of you especially who are kind of driven scientifically, it has some level of meaning because you contemplate the origins of the universe. It certainly is instructive that way. But it's deeply poetic, and it's inspiring because it speaks to the artist. Artwork always reflects the artist. So we can learn something about God in his artistry, in his handiwork, in his creation. When you hear that opening passage from Genesis, what strikes you? Do you hear the beauty? Do you hear the creativity? The mutual dependence? The planet, humans, animals, light, dark, sky, moon, tide, sun. The mystery? The enjoyment and pleasure? Every time you hear that phrase, and God said that it was good. I mentioned this a few weeks ago, but what he's really saying, it's the same feeling you have when you have a great drink or you have you eat a great meal, you put the cup down, you put your fork down, you go, oh, that was so good. That, like when you hear that Genesis passage, that's what you have to hear. Like God is going, oh, did you see that rhinoceros? I mean, he's going, that is so good. So hear that. Hear what's happening with God as he's creating. He's finding such pleasure and enjoyment in it, which, by the way, speaks to the nature of God. Sometimes in religion, we try to suck the pleasure out of life. We're afraid of hedonism, and we're not supposed to enjoy too much. And you hear with God, I mean, it's playful. He's at play. He's having a blast. He's enjoying this. And then he creates this creature called man that's just a little bit different than the rest of creation because it's created in his image. It has this divine imprint. And then he allows man to share in his responsibilities. He literally says, wait, I'm going to share this experience with you and empower you. I'm going to give you some of the responsibility to actually care for this planet and care for these creatures and be in it, be surrounded by it. And of course, woven throughout this entire passage and through the whole meta-narrative of Scripture is love. This was created in love, for love, by love. Why? Because God is love. The song we just sang spoke of the Trinity, that God exists as three persons. He had to, for love to be love. For God to be love, he had to exist in a relational essence. Because love can't help but give itself away. That's what makes it love. There's an ongoing, eternal exchange. Love, by its nature, longs to be known. God longs to be known. And he longs to know you. There's this ever-present invitation, and I think the invitation is reflected in creation. You see it in the environment, in the atmosphere, the animals, the solar system, the ecosystem, the respiratory system, all this design and structure and creativity, but it's all there for a reason. In this seminal passage at the very beginning of the Bible, this massive collection of 66 books, here we have at the very outset, the very opening statement, this profound truth that creation itself sings his glory. We can hear the voice of God in creation. Rohr says this: love can flow toward you in every moment, through the image in a flower, in a grain of sand, in the wisp of a cloud, in any one person whom you allow to delight you. It's why you begin to find yourself smiling at things for no apparent reason. If love is not flowing out of you, for some reason you're here today and you feel stuck, nothing's actually flowing through you, it's probably because you're not allowing it to flow toward you. Or is making the point that creation itself is bombarding you with imagery. There's an opportunity to see the love that's coming your way. Every single human being is an opportunity to find delight. Now, granted, I will acknowledge that there are sometimes you interact with human beings and your first thought is that person's an idiot. But what's happening? In that moment, it's a dehumanizing moment, which happens every time I drive. And I confess this a lot here. I've been doing it for a long time, which clearly means I have some work to do. Which, by the way, I have a story about that. Well, let me finish this other statement first. But we have these moments where we dehumanize people and we go, oh my gosh, what the person, what an idiot. What if instead of saying they're such an idiot, we go, wow, that person is so fascinating. When you're driving in the left-hand lane, you go, 45. You know that says 70, which means 79. Fascinating. I wonder what's going on with you. So here's my story. I shouldn't say this out. Okay, now I'm going to be held accountable. This is good. So I'm with a friend of mine this week, and his name is Brian, and he goes, you know, I was really convicted by God about my driving, and I was like, well, we should probably stop the story right there. And because I was convicted in him just mentioning it. And he goes, yeah, I was really convicted. You know, I just feel like it's just a shift in perspective, right? Like I just should see the world differently. I'm like, yeah, you should probably work on that. I need to order. And he goes, no, he goes, you want to know what's happened? I've totally changed the way I drive. I was like, okay. So he said, here's what I started thinking. What if everybody on the road, what if I looked at them like they were my family? Like, man, that's my daughter in the left-hand lane. She's just learning how to drive. She's going slow, being safe. And I'm like, that a girl. Yeah, just be safe. Go slow. Be careful. You know, and somebody else, they're driving next to me, you know, that's another family member. They got a lot on their mind. It's okay that you didn't flip that little signal. It just went right in front of me. That's okay. No. Come on over. Matter of fact, anybody else, come on. Like, come on. Like, hey, there's my cousin. Come here. Like, maybe we're just connected. There's a bunch of Americans helping the economy. Like, let's go to work. Come on. And you go. You need a vacation. Come on. Put some more stuff in the back of your car. Yeah. It's just family. So I tried it yesterday. I only made it about like 2 cars. So you can pray for me. It's so good though. I mean, really, he's telling me, I'm like, oh, I got some work to do. Because it really is, it's just this shift in perspective. I love the way Roar says it. Like, we can find something if we just choose to delight in it. Shift our perspective, to recognize that love is there. Here's the thing about creation, it surrounds us. I mean, how many of you, when you came in this morning, you came in and you really did? I mean, you really paused long enough to go, whoa, look at that blue sky. And the white clouds, and the way the contrast sits with the green of Tennessee. And boy, that's beautiful, and it's speaking of something. It's saying something about the handiwork of God. Like, you just paused long enough to really absorb it. It surrounds us at all time. I mean, the creation is singing his glory, but a lot of times we just don't see it. Beauty is powerful. Why is it that beauty holds us captive? I mean, any kind of beauty. I think the reason beauty holds us captive is because it's wild. Because it's glorious, because it's actually a little bit intimidating. You know the thing about beauty? You can't control it. You walk up on the Niagara Falls or the Grand Canyon, or maybe even a beautiful person. You walk up on something that you acknowledge as beautiful, could even be some architect designed this incredible building, but you walk up and your eyes register at beauty and you go, this, I'm in awe. Beauty's captivating. And it can't be controlled, so it's a little unsettling. Have you ever looked at something really beautiful and you're like, yeah, I should just go ahead and not look at it anymore because it's just too much? God is singing through creation. It's reminding us of something that's beyond ourselves. Gerald May, who's a psychologist, tells a story about how he was working his practice and he's going. And he just needed a break. He needed to get out. He needed the Sabbath. He loved going to the woods, but it had been a while, so he writes in a book called The Wisdom of the Wilderness, how he finally got away, and he says this: I was feeling an increasingly passionate yearning for something. I called it my longing for God, and of course that's what all our deepest longings really are, but I could just as well have said it was a longing for love, for union, for fully being in life, for being vitally connected with everything. Do you know I mean, can you relate to this? Do you have these moments where you go, I don't feel right. I don't feel connected. I just feel disrupted. And I'm missing something. I'm longing for something. God has set eternity in the hearts of men. There is a longing. And we're called to look for it. We're drawn. That's part of the great romance, to pull us towards something. He goes on to describe his experience of slowing and being still before God in nature, and he writes this. He says, I closed my eyes, I took a breath, I tried to pray a little, and in that moment, I had my first vague sense of the mountain forest welcoming me, a gentle, utterly soft openness of invitation, a tender hospitality. In that sweet atmosphere, my paranoia seemed an insult. A door slammed shut against the mountain's offered embrace. I love what he's saying here, because he's saying, sitting there, finally slowing long enough, it was like nature itself was inviting him to something, and that his stress and his paranoia, his anxiety was actually an insult to nature itself. Do you know the thing about nature? Nature's not in a rush. Ever. Like, if you don't believe me, go sit with a tree. And I want you to watch it grow. Just watch it. Keep watching it. Go, no, I'm going to, like this thing, it's this in diameter, I'm going to watch this thing. Like, this might be a good exercise for some of you. Just go in your backyard and stare at your tree. Hey, what are you doing? Watch my tree grow. Patient, paced, slow. When we spend time with nature, we actually learn to match its rhythms. You know the law of entropy? You kind of become like what you're around. That's why I remind you all the time, you are who you hang out with. If I meet you and I want to learn a little bit about you, all I got to do is meet the people you hang out with, and I'll learn a whole lot about you. You'll learn a whole lot about me. When you spend time in nature, something happens. You start to match its rhythms. It slows us down, and it helps us listen. Because creation is speaking. There is this remember Jesus' teaching where he's talking to religious people and goes, hey, look, if you guys don't want to praise me, it's fine, because the rocks themselves will cry out. Like there is this kind of voice that rises up that speaks to something that's beyond. But creation also seems to be listening. It seems to be in this ever-present place of just listening, and it's a place for wonder. Are we willing to open ourselves up to that kind of transcendence? And the truth of the matter is, if we're just really honest, some of us, no. You don't want to get in nature because you actually don't want to slow down. If you slow down, you might feel something. And some of us are too afraid to feel. Sue Monk Kidd writes this. She says, many of us learn to be afraid of the feelings inside ourselves. Perhaps when we risked expressing them, we met with astonishment and admonishment, which led to embarrassment and vulnerability. So gradually we built an ego structure in which we separated ourselves from our feelings and avoided deep self-disclosure, even to ourselves. Most of us went through something like this in our childhood. For some of you, you dealt with it with a mom. For some of you, it was with a father. Others of you, it was coach, teacher, your peers. I am the oldest of four, three sisters, pretty close to my mom and dad. And my mom would always say, oh, you just grew up a real sensitive kid. Well, sensitivity is wonderful until you get to middle school. The problem is when you're a sixth grade boy and you're crying in gym class, it just doesn't go over real well. So I learned pretty quickly my sensitivity was not a big win. And so I learned in middle school, I got to figure out how to shut this off. Close it off. Stop feeling. Or at least not let anyone know I'm feeling, because it's not safe. Most of us learned some of these mechanisms somewhere. And part of our journey of awakening to our true identity is recognizing we built an ego structure to protect ourselves in the environment that we are in. And by the way, there's no shame in that. You needed it. My ego structure helped me survive. But growing up and growing older and maturing in your faith is coming to an awakening and going, you know what, you served me for a time. I built this ego, but now it has to die. Because this isn't really who I am. It's just my false self. And I want to find who I really am, which means I have to be courageous enough to feel. And this is such a journey for me. My wife has been very helpful for me in helping me feel feelings. There are times I just wouldn't do it. It wouldn't be worth the work for me. And yet, when you do feel, you begin to learn something not just about yourself, but also about God. And here's why. When you go back to that creation story, we were designed to function in intimacy. There's this deep knowing. If you continue reading in the Genesis narrative, you have some anthropomorphisms, which is where we take human characteristics and attribute them to God. Now, sometimes this is disastrous because we then shrink God into a much smaller being than he actually is. But it can be helpful, just metaphorically, if you think of God with a face or walking or whatever. And so there's this imagery in the early story of the garden where God would walk with man in the cool of the day. Well, that imagery was just there to try and give you the picture that God wanted to be intimate with his creation. That God, who's the groundedness of all being, is basically saying, I am love, come and be in love, and that's in relationship as you understand it with the divine being. But when you're not in relationship, you feel separated. It feels broken. It feels dissonant. You don't feel right inside. It doesn't feel congruent. There's an absence of peace. And so all through the meta-narrative of the Bible it's this journey of how to get back to peace, how to get back to joy, how to feel love. But in our stories, for some of us, it was just too dangerous. Your life, your story is about learning how to let love in. How to be loved by God. How to be known by him. By the way, it's the reason that loneliness is the greatest pain of humanity. Because we were designed to not be alone, but to be known. In this life, we cannot deny the incompleteness we feel. All of us feel it at some level. But God knows this. And in his creative pursuit, he beckons us to stop, to look, and to listen. I think the reason I hear God more clearly when I go to the woods more than any other atmosphere is because it just removes the distractions of my ego self. Because some distractions are part of life, right? Like, you got to work, and part of it is being responsible for the planet, and being responsible for our family, being responsible for its creatures. So sometimes you're just distracted by really beautiful and appropriate and good things. But sometimes the distractions are just related to that false self. I have this motor in me, this achievement motor, that's meant to accomplish things, when it's unhealthy, it's measuring my significance or adequacy based on what I've done. When I get out into creation, I'm not accomplishing anything. Although sometimes I'm like, maybe I'll just move these sticks from the path. Look at that, what a beautiful path. Way done, Jamie, you're worth it today. You accomplished something, way to go. Like, that's how sick it can be for me. But if I can really let that stuff go and go, no, I'm just loved, I'm not accomplishing anything, I'm just being. Nature does that for me. I wonder if it might do that for some of you. We must slow down. Intentionally remove ourselves from the digital labyrinths tailored to keep us imprisoned. If we slow down long enough, God's creation has lessons for us everywhere. There's a wonderful story. There's a young woman, her name was Lilias Trotter, and her story was kind of lost for almost, I think, close to 100 years. She lived in the Victorian era. She was a promising painter, like really had the opportunity to be one of the most influential painters of her time. Kind of the masters of the time all saw her as like, this is the one. But she felt this calling from God that she was meant to go and carry the gospel to the Arab people in Algeria. And so fortunately, she didn't stop painting and she didn't stop writing. And some people that just were aware of who she was, just kind of in this dogged pursuit, finally found all those writings and paintings. They put them together into a book called Parables of the Cross. And then actually a documentary was made of her story called Many Beautiful Things. And it's just a wonderful little piece. I think it's on iTunes, Netflix, if you want to be inspired by a young, empowered woman. But she, in her life, because she felt so drawn to God and to people in need, she went to Algeria. But while she was there, she continued to paint and recorded some of those paintings. And of course, because she's in Algeria, she's seeing things she never would have seen in Victorian-era England. And so looking through her book called Parables of the Cross, I came across a painting and something she wrote about the painting. And she wrote about a bush that I'd never heard of before. And so I'm going to put the picture of the bush up, and I want you to hear what she says. She says this: "See this bit of gorse bush? The whole year round, the thorn has been hardening and sharpening. Spring comes, and the thorn does not drop off. It does not soften. So where spring you might have new life, in this case, when spring comes, actually the thorn remains. There it is, as uncompromising as ever. But halfway up appear two brown furry balls, mere specks at first, that break at last straight out of last year's thorn into a blaze of fragrant golden glory." And she wrote this passage down in her journal, Hebrews 12:11. "Now no chastening for the present seemeth to be joyous, but rather grievous. No struggle, no pain, no discipline in the moment feels good. It feels painful. Nevertheless, afterward it yieldeth the peaceable fruit of righteousness." But after that struggle, something happens. Something comes forth when we actually let the struggle finish its work inside us. And she goes on to write, she says, "It is just when it seems most hopelessly unyielding, it is then that the tiny buds appear that soon will clothe it with glory." Take the very hardest thing in your life, the place of difficulty, outward or inward, and expect God to triumph gloriously in that very spot. Just there, He can bring your soul into blossom. A flower that stops short in its flowering misses its purpose. Hang in there. That thing that's so painful right now, that need you have, that place of struggle, she's saying simply by sitting long enough and staring at a bush, she was reminded and inspired that it's that very place that God tends to use. That's the place where his glory is revealed. Have you ever been with an addict who's getting sober? I'm always inspired when I have a conversation with an addict who's been sober or getting sober. And here's my admiration, because I know when I'm talking to them every day, they measure success by a day at a time. Because they feel the magnetism of what's drawing them back to medicate their pain. And when they hang on for one day, it's a celebration. And what do you know about any one of those addicts? They have stared into the pit of death. Because they know, especially when they're addicted to a substance that's going to crush them, you know they're hanging on for dear life. And you look into their eyes and you see that they just made it today. And that was a win. There's a depth to anyone who struggles with that kind of pain. And sometimes beauty emerges in the place of their great pain. Can I remind us of something today? Please let the process of death and dying do its work in you. John 12:24, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, and really pay attention to these three words. Unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. How about stop coping and start dying? Stop medicating and feel. The false self is meant to fall off. Your true identity wants to blossom. And the shell of the false self is just meant to slowly fade away. And there's no judgment for someone else, because their season might not be like yours. Just like those poets and saints, they discovered a God in their own unique way. So when you look at someone else and you go, wow, they just seem like such a hard shell still, and they're not doing what they're meant to. Their season is different. You pray for them and hope for them and encourage them, but pay attention here. How do you let that false self fall away so that you can be who you really are? You can awaken to love. I think one of the ways we get there is to stare into wonder. Is to get curious about who God is and how he loves us. And his absence of judgment, because judgment was absorbed at the cross. There's therefore now no condemnation. And so the voices of condemnation and self-judgment, today, could there be some compassion? Compassion for the environment, for our earth, for our planet, for animals, sure. Compassion for other people, God's creatures, yes. Love your neighbor as yourself. Compassion for you. Some of you are great at giving compassion to other people, but you're just not real good at giving it to yourself. Could there be some compassion for you and a recognition that you were created in love, by love, for love? John Eldredge says this, and he says it quite playfully, and I just love his perspective on this. I think it's important for all of us. He says, we've grown dull toward this world in which we live. We've forgotten that it is not normal or scientific in any sense of the word. It is fantastic. It is a fairy tale through and through. Really now. Elephants, caterpillars, snow. At what point did you lose the wonder of it all? The beauty of creation is a gift. And if we'd have eyes to see and ears to hear, we'll notice that the God of the universe is inviting us into relationship with him. Would you pray with me? Before David leads us, would you just go to a place of reflection, close your eyes, stare at the floor, whatever that is for you. Can I ask you a question this morning, what's your need? What is it that you need? And would you talk to God about that need? Have a conversation with Him. How about that willingness to slow down and to match the rhythms of creation, to pay attention to how God speaks through nature? Are you willing to be intentional? If so, would you talk to God about that willingness or unwillingness? But just have a conversation with God about that. About your willingness to slow down, to Sabbath, to feel. There's so many ways we can hear the voice of God. He's so creative. We would just tune ourselves to that voice. If you're a guest with us, I just want to let you know there's no rush. The band's going to sing about 3 songs, and this space for us is really about slowing everything and listening to the voice of God. There's some words and some music, and perhaps you want to sing along and let that be part of your praise and your worship and acknowledgement, kind of a speaking out, singing out of gratitude. We've got communion set up in the back part of our room, in the back right. So you're welcome to get up and go there, take the bread, dip it in the cup. Remember the great rescue operation of the Trinity. This space is for you. It's maybe first time all week you've just slowed down enough to listen, to feel. Father, you're so full of grace and kindness and patience. Thank you for the creativity that's represented in this room, each one of us, your unique creations. God, connect us. Connect us. Would we let ourselves be loved? Would we recognize we were created in love for love? Speak to our hearts, Father. And would you receive in this moment, here we are, your creation singing back about glory. We're available and we're present.